So, welcome to the latest episode of the Growth Ripples podcast. Today, it's a pleasure to be joined by Sumit. Sumit comes all the way from Delhi, joining us online. So, Sumit, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jan. It's a pleasure to be here and good afternoon.
Thank you. And so just a quick intro on Sumit and how I know Sumit. We've only known each other for a few months, but it's quite an amazing story, I think, in terms of, I was starting up Growth Wave and Growth Ripples, and I was looking for some support and help, particularly around some of the online wording around what I was using on my website, but also on a lot of my posts. And I hadn't really used LinkedIn that much. And Sumit, I came across Sumit via using Upwork, and I was so impressed in terms of the work that he was doing. And I've learned, I think, more from Sumit than anyone else on LinkedIn. He's a little known gem, but I know more and more people are using him both locally and globally. So it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And a particular reason why I wanted to chat with you is your deep expertise and experience working in HR and working in consulting, both locally in India, but also for global clients. So I'd love to have a chat today just about what are some of the key issues that you're hearing from your clients, but also, what are some of the top sort of trends or things that you think people are either worried about or that they should perhaps be worried about. So maybe over to you and let you start wherever you want to start, Sumit.
I'll start by saying you've been extraordinarily kind to me, and a lot of the compliments are unwarranted. But on that note, so what I'm hearing a lot from clients is around how to cater to well-being. So people are feeling the pinch in terms of budgets, in terms of money being restricted. So, of course, if you had an unlimited coffers and you had lots of money, there's no dearth of things around well-being you could do. But how do we invest in well-being without breaking the bank and without really running to upper management and saying, you asked us to cut cost, but we need to spend a little more?
Yeah, okay. And so for well-being, I mean, with your clients, I mean, when I think of well-being, at least in an Australian context, a lot of that goes around both the physical and the mental health of employees. Is that sort of the same definition within your clients as well?
It has been, and I find physical and mental well-being have both evolved in the last 5 years. So starting from saying, hey, here's a fitness tracker, now go do your 10,000 steps, or here's a training on mindfulness, which you should attend because there are lots of demands in your time. People are becoming a lot more receptive to hearing from employees what is it that's troubling them. So if I'm stressed at work, I can't sleep well, it affects my physical well-being. What are you as an employer doing about it, aside from giving me an app subscription or saying, hey, the onus is on you, get your 8 hours of sleep? How is the question when you're sending me an email at 2 a.m.? So I think the needle definitely has moved on that front, but a key thing that's emerging is financial well-being, especially with a lot of uncertainty, inflation skyrocketing, and so much pressure on employees' own wallets.
Yeah, absolutely. And what really resonated for me there, what you're saying, Sumit, from my HR time in terms of internal HR is, there's can be this popular sort of well-intentioned idea that let's just like pump out e-learning or pump out some workshops about how to get more sleep and how to, exercise well, which are all important tips and tricks, or if you like. But at the end of the day, you got to look at the systematic things. So if we're inundating our employees with too much work, or if we're contacting them 24 hours a day or expecting them to be online all the time and switched on, then what impact is that having on well-being, as opposed to just putting the nice cosmetic things like, oh, here you are, here's the Fitbit or a gym membership. But if we're contacting you 24/7, or you have fear of this, your well-being and your livelihood at work, then chances are that's going to do nothing. It's just going to be putting lipstick on a pig.
Oh, absolutely. And it's like, and I've been guilty of this as well, saying you must attend a mandatory wellness program or a mindfulness training right after work today. So you end your shift at 5. We're holding it at 5:30. Take a break, come back, attend the training.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. It doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. So what have you found, like, I imagine it's a little bit different depending on the client, but are there any key things that you're seeing as being quite impactful and universal in some of the clients that you're working with?
Um, what I really love about many of the clients I currently work with is the fact that they're willing to listen. So no longer is conversation around well-being happening in boardrooms and saying, "Hey, you know what? I feel we should do this." I mean, you're a C-suite executive. You've got a fair amount of money. You've got a fair amount of power and resources. The way you manage your expenses, your household, childcare, a lot of other
Mm,
things is very different from what a frontline employee would. So, I mean, I call it the map of Africa problem, because when the colonial powers were dividing up Africa, they didn't really bother with what was happening on the ground. They just sat in a room, drew some straight lines, and that's why till date a lot of the African country borders that you see would be straight lines.
all
So,
right.
which is
Mm,
also a cause for much of the conflict that's happening there. And
yeah.
I think
Mm,
that's definitely something to stay away from.
yeah.
So
I
it's
love that
great that people are
analogy.
going.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorites, and it's a cautionary tale to not
Mm.
fall into the same trap.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's certainly the way of the past or some status quo sort of companies where it's like, well, we'll tell them what they should do because we know best and it's top down, as opposed to maybe let's listen to our people because they often know what's best for them, or they've got some ideas and then we can sort of massage something that will work best. I mean, in a similar vein, I find with a lot of my clients, not dictating what people should or shouldn't do and seeing that well-being is different for different people. So take myself as an example, and you know, you're a father as well. What well-being and balance and flexibility means to me might be very different to, you know, a 20-year-old who's just come out of university and wants to be in the office, wants to be going out after work on a regular basis with, you know, workmates and what have you. And so making sure that you're not force fitting one solution for everyone when different people will have different needs and different well-being challenges.
Absolutely, and that's where I love your focus on growing more than the market and being different, because many times we focus on benchmarking, trying to figure out what somebody else in the industry is doing. But what if your average age is, say, 25 years and you've got young college grads in the setup? The other company is mostly, say, 35-year-old people with master's degrees or with PhDs. I mean, you can't
Mm,
you can't just generalize that bit of the demographic and say, hey, same industry, this is what's going to work.
yes,
And
yeah,
even
yeah.
if the demographic is same, you still need to customize it to what is it that's your culture, your vision, your
Mm.
business objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's definitely music to my ears in terms of making sure it's tailored to the employees and to the business. And I find even thinking about what's the strategy of the business, because if you can align the well-being around that, so, you know, as an example, if it's all about making sure that we're providing tailored solutions to clients, then as a result, we should have tailored solutions for employees. And really, employees are an extension of our customers, because if our employees are happy, generally they'll make our customers happy. So, you know,
Absolutely.
that's, yeah, yeah. And I guess one thing I wanted to touch back on is, and we talked about it just before we started the podcast, but you know, there is that piece about, you know, making sure well-being is front and center. There's also a piece playing both locally and globally around, you know, the rising inflation. We're seeing a lot more companies like Facebook and many others actually cutting, and Twitter cutting jobs, and so there's a lot of fear in a lot of, you know, employees. You know, what are you seeing in this space in terms of how the best companies are addressing those kind of concerns?
Um, One of my favorite examples I mean, it's a little ironic to use favorite and layoff in the same sentence, but um, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the companies that was worst hit by um, the effect of the virus was Airbnb, and the way they handled uh, laying people off was probably the most humane way they could. So they gave generous severance packages. They provided outplacement support. They arranged for counseling for friends and family, and they even let people keep the technology assets. So they said, you're going to be looking for a new job. A laptop is the bare minimum you need. Just take it with you. And the extended healthcare coverage. In the US, of course, they could extend it to the same year. For people in other locations, they arranged for some tie-ups with different vendors, made sure it was possible. So you don't have to lose people centricity just because it's a business reason due to which you're laying people off. And the example of Twitter, I mean, we know the brand value of Twitter that's taking a hit, and advertisers are pulling out. It's not that they're trying to save a lot of cost through layoff. They're losing far more in terms of revenue. And in fact, I was talking to a leader at a major IT company who's looking at layoffs, and what they're doing is they're adopting a last in, first out approach. So imagine you're let's say there's somebody based in Melbourne. They've moved to, say, Sydney for a job with home and family. And 15 days later, they're being told, hey, you know what? We've got a last in, first out kind of a system at work here. So sorry, we will have to let you go in about 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think we've spoken about this on LinkedIn in particular, and and I guess different countries have different laws or practices around it. And I know at least in Australia, and I don't know in India or even in the States, but like often I find companies, it's a cost saving thing as well, because redundancies, if they're mandated, if there's some sort of award or some sort of legislative requirement, that if they get rid of the people that have arrived the most recently, then they're going to save money, but also they're going to be at less risk of being, sued or some other action from longer tenured employees. Now, of course, there's always exceptions depending on the skills that someone needs. But yeah, I think that humanity piece that you talk about, and I didn't know about the Airbnb one, so thank you for sharing that. I hadn't heard about all of the bits and pieces that they did, including giving the hardware. One of the things that, I think important for us to talk about is around that survivor guilt, and you touched on it earlier. What do you find, clients doing not well, and inversely, those that are doing better, how are they differentiating when it comes to that survivor guilt component?
I mean, I've heard complete silence around survivor guilt, and the entire focus has been on we're laying people off, and some companies are being a little more honest about it. Some are issuing press releases that read like a long legal document saying some strategic restructuring of our global priorities and stuff that doesn't make any sense to the reader at all. But I don't think anyone is talking as much to the survivors or addressing what their concerns are. And I've seen this across different organizations in various sectors. I think it would just be great if leaders could start talking to these people, talking about what is it that's worrying them and what should they be doing. I mean, I don't know if I'll have a job tomorrow or not. How do you expect me to focus on the goals you've given me?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think what I've seen in companies having had to, at various times, make roles and individuals redundant is that, how they're treated on the way out also impacts, of course, the people that are staying. So the survivors, if you like. And then that survivor guilt can creep in if you think someone better than you or better performer has lost their job and you haven't. And then there's that fear of, oh, am I next? And if managers just focus on who's left and then just focus on, okay, let's move forward around what our goals are, and they don't address those underlying concerns, what can often happen is people start looking for other jobs or they become disengaged and then they underperform. So that communication about, look, you're here because of X, or we really value because of Y, it's such a powerful piece that really employers really need to get the most out of, because often doesn't cost you anything, but just having that communication can be so powerful. Do you find that as well, Sumit?
Absolutely. And the reason why not too many people have heard of the Airbnb story is because layoffs at Airbnb were not such a big deal, whereas they were among the first companies, being in the hospitality sector, to lose employees. But the reason there's less noise around them, is because they handled it beautifully. And even earlier, companies like Microsoft, they've I mean, I was a young intern back during the subprime crisis when the world was melting down all around us,
Mm.
and being laid off was a dirty word. So if you're being laid off, clearly there's something wrong with you. So this is about
Mm.
a almost a decade and a half ago. Um, at least in the
Yeah.
Indian context, being laid off means you're worthless,
Yeah.
and it
Mm.
was a very very strong word to use. But at Microsoft back then, they had counseling, they had outplacement support, they were more than happy to give out recommendation letters, and there
Mm.
was a lot of internal conversation. I mean, I was uh, a mere intern, but um, my guide, despite working 14 hours a day to stabilize the organization, she sat me down, explained that it's not about the people, it's about us. We have failed to live up to our business commitments. We're the ones who are struggling, and we didn't live up to what we forecast. So
Mm.
we're having to let some great people go. It's extremely sad, but at the same time, we'll commit to doing better in the future. And
Yeah.
it's no surprise, it's one of the organizations with the best employee experience today.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a great point, and contrasting that, I was just thinking about what Facebook sort of what they came out with, and I think Mark Zuckerberg, at least I heard in the reports, I don't know how true it is, but I think he was accused of saying a lot of people haven't been performing, and that's why we need to now let all these people go, as opposed to what you just said there is like, well, management, we as a leadership team or a leadership group, we haven't done everything that we could have, or we've missed forecasts, or some things out of our control, because that's just life sometimes. But instead, shifting the blame on employees is never a good strategy in my experience, and by the sounds of it, yours as well. So yeah, I think you really touch on a really critical piece for if your business is suffering from a downturn or expecting it, making sure you don't make it about employees and you make it about what has gone wrong at a transparent level from the leadership down, and then actually doing what you can to support goes a long way, particularly if you've got clients and customers, because the last thing you want to do is really piss off someone who's leaving the organization. We know Glassdoor and all these other avenues where people hear about it. And I think people like myself, I went off Twitter as soon as I started hearing about what was happening there, because I wasn't using it much anyway. But as soon as I started hearing about what Elon Musk was doing, I wanted nothing to do with that, as a company. So I think that's the risk, and it's very short term. If we just focus on let's cut costs immediately, get people out as quick as we can, we lose something if we're just focused on the efficiency around it.
Agreed. And I mean, Twitter is definitely a case study, and it's the material of maybe a Harvard case at some point in the future,
I think so.
because they also were too hasty in firing people and then saying, hey, we fired you by accident. Why didn't you come back? I
Yeah,
mean,
that was. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up, could you, Sumit? I remember hearing. I don't know if it was you or someone. I remember posting on LinkedIn about they had to come up with a new field in Workday, their HR system,
yeah,
saying accidentally fired or something. Was
accidentally
that you
fired.
who
Yeah.
posted that? Yeah, yeah. It's just
Yeah.
like you can't make this stuff up. It's like something out of Black Mirror or what have you. One thing I wanted to touch on, maybe just as we're probably running a bit close on time, but I guess we're seeing, and we've both worked in a lot of the status quo consulting companies. And I don't know if you saw that news about Ernst and Young, even though they had one of the best years ever, they announced recently that they were not going to be paying bonuses and what have you for the year that's been. What are your thoughts on this? Because, like traditionally, if you think from a REM perspective, bonus is about past performance, and then salary is really about future performance. So what are your thoughts on that decision from Ernst and Young? And, there's probably going to be other consulting firms that will follow suit, but I was keen to get your thoughts on this.
I'm, I mean, it left me confused. I couldn't figure out what was the message they were trying to send to employees. And of course, we've only been party to what has come out in the news, but I'd really love to be a fly on the wall when a partner is explaining this to their own team and saying, because of the financial performance, I'll be taking home my fair share of equity. I'm sorry, it didn't really work out well for you folks.
Yeah.
Better luck next time. I mean, But if a partner is willing to say, I'll take a hit, uh, it's not been a great year. Um, so one of the consulting firms in India, they handled it in a different way. They said, the year has not been great. We've barely met our targets.
Yep.
We are not really giving you a pay cut, but we're converting some part of your total pay into, we're increasing the percentage of variable pay. And
Okay.
next year, if we do well,
Mm.
we'll pay you double of your variable pay.
Wow. Okay. So putting a bit of skin in the game to say, look, if you help us perform or outperform, I think I kind of like that strategy. I mean, coming back to Ernst and Young, maybe I misread it, but my understanding was that Ernst and Young has actually had one of the most profitable years in their history. So they're kind of doing the non-bonus thing, forward looking to say we're expecting, big tailwinds or what have you, or whatever the analogy people want to use. So therefore, we're not paying bonuses. But to your point, and for those that don't know, most of these big four and the big accounting or consulting companies, they're partnerships. So the partners take away the profit and the profit pool. So it's an amazing strategy if they're still paying, top profit share to the partners, but then the employees who've actually done the grunt work get no bonus. I mean, I think that's a very dangerous strategy.
It is. And despite the layoffs, there are choices and there are people dropping out of the workforce everywhere. I mean, you could take the baggage traffic jams at airports like Heathrow as examples of people not coming back to work after the pandemic because they want to be paid better. You can take shortages of employees everywhere. So while there are people being laid off, there also are shortages in practically every industry. And it's because people are refusing to work for below a certain wage.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and maybe one to finish up on, Sumit. I think we could probably, spend hours talking together, and I'm hoping that we'll do some future podcasts together. But really wanted to thank you for your time, and maybe just to wrap up. I mean, I think the one point that I took away from what you just shared there was, companies need to be focused on not only attracting people, but how do you retain them through paying well, but also treating people well, so their well-being, coming full circle to the beginning of our podcast, they're doing the full suite because, I think there are such shortages, like you said, that companies can't afford to not treat their employees well because they can often get other options locally and globally. So Sumit, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it, and hope that you can join us on the podcast again in the future.
Definitely. Thank you, Jan. Have a nice day ahead.
You too. Cool. Well, thank you so much. How was that for you?